Hey, what's up, YouTube? This is Juju here with another deck profile. Today we're going to be going over Mama Odie OTK Ramp. That's right, Mama Odie OTK Ramp. This is a deck that I made 2 days ago, and since playing it on ladder, it's been 26 and 5. So 26 wins, 5 losses, a couple games on hardcore ranked. I won all best of threes, but it doesn't show that stat on Pixelborn, so it is what it is. But yeah, the deck is pretty fun. If you like drawing cards, ramping up to insane ink levels, and I guess old people, then I guess this is the deck for you. All right, going into the summary. So basically, the whole game plan is to play Mama Odie, ramp up with your collection of songs, hopefully summon either Gramma Tala to help you gain lore during that process, and then finish off with Gaston, Yzma, Friend Like Me. Yeah, pretty much that's pretty much the game plan. You can hit 20 lore in one turn just by playing. If you have two Mama Odies on board, two Gramma Talas on board, and you play two Friend Like Me, that's 20 lore for that combo, and you win. You basically win the game. Obviously, you don't need to play all those cards to win the game. That's kind of Friend Like Me is kind of like your finisher. Typically, it's more common to end the game with maybe like a 4 to 5 lore burst. But there are some insane strings that this deck can do with just one Mama Odie and one Gramma Tala. I think the most ink I've ever ramped up in a single turn was 15, and that was like turn 5 or 6. So it's pretty darn good. Anyways, let's just go into the card choices. So we have one Popsicle, four Gramma Tala, four One Jump Ahead, four Fishbone Quill, four Mama Odie, four Haram Flavorsham, four Friend Like Me, four Gaston, four Gramma Tala, four Chernobog's Followers, four It Calls Me, four Rafiki, four Blue Fairy, four Friends on the Other Side, and four Yzma. Lots of just max copies. Honestly, I'm still toying with the list. I made this like 2 days ago, so um, yeah, I'm still playing around with all these cards. But honestly, the running max copies of each of these cards allows for max consistency, and it's been a huge help in my games. And it's kind of reflects that in the win loss record, right? Like I'm 26 and 5, and I haven't lost a best of 3 in hardcore rank, so it's pretty good. Um, the wins against this deck, pretty much, or the decks that I beat, pretty much all meta decks, except for like the random like gimmicky decks that you run into on ladder. I'm undefeated against Green Purple, beat Steel Song, beat Ruby Amethyst, beat Ruby Sapphire, and definitely beat Sapphire Steel. So the deck is pretty good, I'd say. Of course, take this with a grain of salt. This is, it's still a new deck. Also, I don't know, my opponents might have not been playing well. So this could easily be, maybe at like the higher yellows, this might be a little bit harder of a matchup. However, I do think that this deck has some gas, and we'll get into why that is. So we talked about a little bit of the strategy. It's basically to ramp with your songs with Mama Odie and hopefully have a Gramma Tala on board while playing Gaston and Yzma and all your other cards for cycle. But let's get into like the deeper game plan, right? So the broken thing about this deck is turn one, play a 1 drop, turn two, play a 2 drop creature like Gramma Tala or Blue Fairy, and then turn three, play Mama Odie. If you still have your 1 drop and if you still have your 2 drop on board, you can sing your 1 drop song like It Calls Me, and you can sing One Jump Ahead to basically ramp to 6 ink. Yeah, if you're playing One Jump Ahead and It Calls Me. If you're playing just the One Jump Ahead, it ramps you to 5 ink. That's completely fine though, and I'll tell you why. Because when you play the Gramma Tala, right, or the Blue Fairy for that matter, sing One Jump Ahead while you have the Mama Odie on board puts you to 5 ink on turn 3. Turn 4, you can ink one more card to either play a 6 cost card like Gaston or Yzma, or you can, if you have big Gramma Tala in hand and you have Gramma Tala on board, you can shift the Gramma Tala and then ink to play one more card or one more 1 cost card. It's a pretty good opening. Probably one of the stronger openings in the game. Turn 4, you get to 6 ink, and you have a 4/8, a 4/4 that nets you another card, a 6 drop that nets you another card, and a 1/3. And not to mention, like, if you have your 1 drop still, like a Rafiki or Chernobog's, you have complete command of the game at that point, or resources for that matter. So, really good opening. If for some reason you brick, you always have the Popsicle 1 jump ahead Haram line. That's a completely fine line. Honestly, I'm thinking about taking out the Popsicle and Fishbone Quill Haram package for something else, but we'll leave that we'll talk about that more in a later section. But yeah, going back to the game plan, really powerful opening, and it's super consistent. Even if you don't hit 1 jump ahead, you can just play your followers, your Rafiki, your Blue Fairy, your Gramma Tala, your Mama Odie, and you can still ramp up just fine. Yeah, you just play it slower, but because of the amount of ramp that you have and the amount of cycle that this deck has as well, you can essentially ramp faster than your opponent and summon your high value creatures like Gaston, Gramma Tala, and Yzma to essentially get you to win game and control board and so on and so forth. Yeah, so that's the deck. Friend Like Me is there for burst damage, and as far as matchups are pretty solid. They're pretty well balanced all around. I haven't had problems with aggro decks, and we'll talk about that in the card choices and why I make those choices. So, for Popsicle, Fishbone Quill, Huron Flavor Sham, these are kind of like, it's the item package, right? I think it feels bad just running 4 Popsicle and 4 Haram, so I use the extra 4 slots to sub in a Fishbone Quill. Heart of Tafiti also works here, but yeah, I chose Quill because it's another way to ramp up. Most of the time, though, I'm using Haram and Fishbone for like ink, unless I need a body on board, and Haram is the only thing I have in my hand. But yeah, those are pretty much the item Haram package. We can talk about that later. After that, we have our 1-drops. So Chernobog's Follower and Rafiki are really powerful 1-drops in this deck. Rafiki, it's a 1 mana 3/2. That's pretty good stats. Obviously, it's only when it's attacking. When it's exerted, and when it's exerted, it pretty much is a sitting duck. So you never want to be the one to have it exerted in the first place unless you've already traded with it. Basically, the whole purpose of running Chernobogs and Rafiki is to deter your opponent from questing turn 1 and allowing yourself to give time to set up your Mama Odie 2-drop plays, right? So Rafiki is good for this. Chernobog's Follower is also good for this. Chernobog also has the added effect where whenever this character quests, you may banish them to draw a card. And the extra cycle is super helpful, especially in slower matchups against Ruby Sapphire and Ruby Amethyst. Sometimes I'll just keep the Chernobogs there or the Rafiki there just to sing It Calls Me while I have Mama Odie on board. That's a completely fine play too. Moving on to our 2-drop creatures, we have Gramma Tala and Blue Fairy. So these cards, these are the best 2-drops for the deck, and I'm going to stand by that. First one, Gramma Tala is pretty self-explanatory. It pretty much nets you your whole win condition. You can ramp with it. You can use it to set up a shift for the Gramma Tala play. It's a 2-drop, so it can sing 1 jump ahead. And the other thing is, after you sing 1 jump ahead with Mama Odie and Gramma Tala on turn 3, and it nets you to 5 lore, even if they kill the Gramma Tala while it's exerted, that gets you to 6 ink for the following turn, which allows you to ink again turn 4, right, to play your 7 ink cost Gramma Tala. So even if they destroy the Gramma Tala, you can still play Gramma Tala on turn 4, which is really powerful. And even if you don't have the Gramma Tala in hand, or the big Gramma Tala in hand, you can play Gaston, Yzma, so on and so forth to keep the resources flowing. So Gramma Tala is great. Blue Fairy is also great. So Blue Fairy is pretty cracked in this deck because it's evasive, so it can't get targeted unless it's getting attacked by another evasive character. It can sing one jump ahead. It's inkable, and then its effect: when you play a Floodborn character, you may draw a card. All of your higher cost minions are or minions characters are Floodborn pretty much outside of Haram Flavorsham, but Haram is 4 cost. So I guess that's not a high cost card. Anyways, Gaston, Gramma Tala, Yzma are all Floodborn, so when you play Blue Fairy, you sing with this on turn 2. No, turn 3. Nets you to 5 lore. Turn 4, ink a card, play an Yzma, Gaston, or Gramma Tala, and you get to draw. Um, Along with the cycle that they already offer with their own effect, right? So you can potentially draw 3 cards with Yzma if you put back the Blue Fairy. Make sure to proc the Blue Fairy effect first before you send it back, or you can just play the Gaston and do that. I'm still playing around with order of like which ones you want to proc first when you play Gaston or Yzma. With Yzma, it's definitely proc the Blue Fairy first and then proc the Yzma effect. But with Gaston, it's a little interesting because my instinct tells me that you want to sift through your cards and proc the Gaston effect first before you play Blue Fairy or before you use the Blue Fairy effect. But I don't know. It's up for grabs. Um, but yeah, this card is insanely good. Don't get me started when you get multiple of them on the board, because when you get like 2 to 3 Blue Fairy and you play an Yzma or Gaston, so much value. Or Gramma Tala, oh my gosh. There have been so many games where I've had 2 Blue Fairy on board and I just get so much value off of summoning a Gaston, which is already value enough because it's 3 lore, 4/4, and it replaces itself, right? So great card overall. There are other 2 drops that you can include. We'll talk about that later, but for this section of the deck profile, I think it's safe to say that Gramma Tala and Blue Fairy are the best options for 2 drop on this deck. Cool. After that, we have our 3 drops. It's Mama Odie. Mama Odie is just so good. I think Mama Odie is a better form of ramp than Fishbone Quill. 1, because it doesn't exhaust your hand. 2, it doesn't die to Debenja. Of course, it dies to like other things, but um, you're never going to want to exert a Mama Odie unless it's for singing a song. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, you just get so much value off of this. Like Mama Odie turn 3, sing one jump ahead. It already gets you to 5. You play Fishbone Quill, you ink 1. It costs you a card, by the way. So you're losing a card in hand, and it only gets you to turn to 4. Um, Mama Odie has the ability to net you as much ramp as you can as long as you have a deck, because it doesn't pull cards from your hand in order to ramp. Yeah, unless you're playing a song. But if your songs, you know, replace themselves, I don't know, if they help you draw cards, then you won't have a problem. So Mama Odie is really good, and the songs that we'll include or we're going to like go over in the deck, you'll see why this deck is just insane for ramp. Uh, Finishing it off, we'll go into our larger drops. So Gaston, we run 4 of these. Gaston is really good. It replaces itself. It's uninkable, but I think in a deck like this, it's completely fine. And yeah, it's 3 lore. 3 lore for 6 mana, which is really good. It puts a lot of pressure on your opponent. It replaces itself. It allows you to cycle through to other powerful cards. Maybe reach for more Gramma Tala, more Yzmas, just more threats in general. Um, it's a really solid card in the deck. Then we have Gramma Tala. Gramma Tala is pretty much the thing that will get you to your win condition, right? Essentially, when you play Gramma Tala on board, it'll automatically net you like, I don't know, 1 to 2 lore, sometimes even more if you have like a Mama Odie or a friend like me. Yeah, it's pretty good. Obviously, there's the OTK where you summon 2 Grammatalas, 2 Mama Odie, play 2 Friend Like Me, and the way this is achievable, of course, is you sing with the Grammatalas. But it's so common for you to net like 3 to 4 lore just from 1 Grammatala summon, and if they can't get rid of it, it's just increased value, right? So lots of value with Grammatala. You want to kind of just like, if for all my Hearthstone players out there, it feels like this card is like a fireball or a pyroblast. Um, but even then, like even if you get this out on board and you don't have any ramp, it's a 4/8 body, and it quests for 2 lore automatically, so it's really good. You don't have to keep it exerted. If you feel like your opponents don't have outs, you can just use Gramma Tala for pressure, and that's totally fine. And then lastly, we have Yzma. This is our form of soft removal in the deck, as well as a form of cycle. Really good card. Um, One of the reasons why I like it is because it's inkable, and even though it nets your opponent two cards, you're going to be outpacing your opponent because of your ramp, and you'll have more tempo. And if you have more tempo and you just keep your opponent off board, that just gets you closer to your win condition, right? Because you can just keep luring, you can just keep inking with Gramma Tala, singing with Mama Odie, and while keeping it safe. So, great card overall, super versatile, and it's also inkable. Yeah, and those are like the creatures. Going over the songs, so One Jump Ahead is pretty self-explanatory. I'll just talk about the song singing real quick because singing is kind of busted. The reason why singing is busted is because you essentially get to play a song for free as long as you have a creature on board, right? That nets you an insane amount of tempo, and it's so common to have blue fairies, a field like blue fairies, Grammatalas, Mama Odies, Harams on board because they just kind of like stay alive, um, due to like either their stats or their traits. But it's so common to just have a field of creatures and then just go off with Mama Odie because you don't have to pay any ink to play these cards, and it's so impactful. So One Jump Ahead is one of those cards. Um, I mean, yeah, just all the songs in general. Okay, that was my rant for songs. We'll talk about the individual song choices now. One Jump Ahead is obviously self-explanatory. You get to ramp pretty fast with this card. It helps you in your with you. It helps you with your win condition. The one thing I like about One Jump Ahead in this deck is that you're always happy to see it. Outside of like other ramp decks that I've tried with One Jump Ahead, towards the later end of the game, you kind of feel like it's a dead draw. With this deck, it's 1 lore, 2 lore if you have Mama Odie and Gramma Tala on board, right? So, um, it's a good card. Friend Like Me, we're running 4 of these. I think it's okay to run 4 of these, even though it's kind of like a slower card. So, Friend Like Me is kind of like your finisher card, right? You're playing this card when you have 1 or 2 Grammatalas. Maybe, hey, if you have 4 Grammatalas on board and you play this card, wow, that's insane. But you're playing this card as burst damage. Think of it like Fireball and Hearthstone, pretty much. So you can play it for free if you have a Gaston or Yzma on board. You can also play it for free if you have Grammatala on board. One thing that I do want to note is that in certain matchups you want to be careful of your timing with Friend Like Me. So, you know, especially in like matchups where you're playing a deck that uses Ruby cards, you kind of want to be mindful of ramping your opponent up as well. And yeah, that's pretty much the thing you want to be careful of, right? Because if you ramp up your opponent and your opponent gets like 7 ink while you have a field full of creatures and they're playing Ruby, it just kind of feels bad. So be careful with the timing on this card. But overall, it's just so great and versatile, right? You can sing with it. Nets you 3 lore with Grammatala, 4 lore if you have Mama Odie. You know, it's a really good card, and you can play it for free. So one of your finisher cards. And hey, don't if you don't want to play it, you can always just ink it, and it's a very good choice to ink, in my opinion. Like the cards that I usually ink are usually like Fishbone Quill, Haram, Friend Like Me, when I don't need them. So yeah. Okay, moving on to the next one. Well, Friends on the Other Side. We'll talk about Friends on the Other Side first. Friends on the Other Side is a really good card, especially in this deck. One, it's cycle. Two, you can play it for free because it's a song. Three, it's inkable. It just checks all of the boxes that help you get to your win condition, right? So it's not uncommon to turn 3 Mama Odie ramp And then if you don't have any of your big minions yet, you can play another Mama Odie and then friends on the other side to ramp two and draw two, uh, and still have ink to play or ink to spend. It's pretty busted. So yeah, Pot of Greed for all my Yu-Gi-Oh players out there. Okay, and then the final song that we use is "It Calls Me." So "It Calls Me" is really good in this deck. There are a lot of reasons why. One, it's obviously inkable. Two, it's a song, so lots of Mama Odie synergy. The other thing that I want to point out is it's a one cost song. So, I mean, hey, if you ever get into a situation where you have a Mama Odie on board and you have four It Calls Me and four ink to spend, play all those It Calls Me, and you're suddenly at what, 8 mana without having to spend a card because It Calls Me draws a card for you. Pretty good, pretty good synergy there. It allows you to obviously it allows you to cycle through your deck. The underrated thing about this card is that you get to choose three cards from your opponent's discard and shuffle them into their deck. And the reason why I say this is underrated is because there are going to be situations where you're playing your opponent and both of you two are top decking, or your opponent's looking for an answer to your board, maybe digging for a Be Prepared or a Tinkerbell or, Grab Your Sword, and they're looking for the out, essentially, right? What It Calls Me does, because you get to choose up to three cards from your chosen opponent's discard pile and shuffle them into your deck. You can choose all of the weak cards that they played in the early game and put it back into their deck to dilute their draws. And that's really good. Especially in top decking situations, this card is like super underrated. I mean, you're already going to be at like 15, 14 ink by this time, so it doesn't matter like what's 1 mana to you, or what's spending 1 ink to you. So it's really good in top decking situations. Great with Mama Odie. Helps you draw deeper into your deck, so you can keep playing Gastons and Yzmas. Yeah, and those are the individual card choices. If I had to talk about cards that you can replace, I'm looking at the Popsicle package for sure. I think Fishbone Quill, Haram, Popsicle you can probably replace with other cards. You can probably replace some Friend Like Me. You can probably replace some Yzma. One thing that I do want to note about the deck is this deck is running 12 uninkable cards, which is generally fewer uninkables than most Sapphire decks. I like it though, because it's really important for you to be able to ink to get to those important like checkpoints, right? Like you need to be able to ink on turn 4 to play your Gramma Tala or Gaston, right? Depending on your board and if you drew one jump ahead. It's just really important to be able to ink every turn for the first couple of turns at least. So I haven't really had a problem with running just 12. I think 12 is a good number for this deck. You can experiment with higher numbers, but just know that I really do believe that it's important to be able to ink for at least 4 turns, the beginning 4 turns, and in order to do that while still contesting board and while still playing things, you have to be able to rely on drawing inkable cards. So that's why I only play like 12 uninkables. All right. We are done with card choices. Let's go ahead and talk about alternatives. One of the options is Elsa. Elsa's a Floodborn 3 lore character that prevents your opponent from readying up and exerts opponents. So it serves as a form of soft removal by exerting their opponents, and it also serves as a form of freeze. So, you prevent your opponent from readying up. They can't quest, they can't sing, they can't attack. It's a great way to stop your opponent's momentum, so Elsa is definitely worth considering. Ursula is also worth considering. Big body for sure. 2/8, 3 lore, prevents your opponent from, or makes your opponent lose lore, and you also draw cards. The only things that concern me are, one, it's uninkable, so I'm probably only playing like 1 or 2 copies, and 2, it has 2 strengths, so it's really good Medusa like bait. Yeah, so if you're playing against Ruby, just be mindful that you might, if you're playing Ursula and you play the Ursula, you might get Medusa the following turn. So that's always something you have to consider. Hades as well, for the same reason. 7 mana uninkable, 3 strength, which means it's a Medusa target. Great form of removal, though. I wouldn't mind running 1 or 2 copies of this card in the deck. The only thing that's stopping me is that it's uninkable. Tamatoa is also an interesting option. I think if you are running more items, Tamatoa can definitely be something to use, especially if you're running like Popsicles, Lucky Dimes, Fishbone Quills. Um, yeah, Tamatoa is one of my favorite creatures in the game. I'm sad I'm not using it, but I think if you ever try an alternative list, definitely try out Tamatoa and let me know how that goes because yeah, Tamatoa is just a fun card and it's fun using it with Lucky Dime. Like you play Tamatoa, have like 5 items on board, including a Lucky Dime, and you dime the Tamatoa and you get 6 lore. That's pretty fun. And then Lucky Dime is also an alternative you can use. I think, you know, there's just so much synergy, and Lucky Dime is a pretty good card, especially in greedier metagames, because you get immediate value from the creatures you play by having a Lucky Dime on board. What I mean by that is, if I had a Gaston, I don't have to wait 1 turn to quest with Gaston. I just have a Lucky Dime on board, play the Gaston, pay the cost for the Lucky Dime, get 3 lore automatically. So, really good card in the deck. I mean, I think it's worth experimenting with. If you do run Lucky Dime, consider Magicka Dispel. Dispel is an interesting option because you can run the 2-drop Magicka Dispel, and it kind of serves the same purpose as Blue Fairy and Gramma Tala, right? You get to play Mama Odie on 3, sing 1 jump ahead with Magicka Dispel, get to 5 ink for next turn, and then you get to shift into Magicka. You won't have an item on board, but that's just something to consider. Let's go into spells, alternative spells. Oh, we'll talk about the lower cost cards actually. So lower cost cards, Maleficent's always a solid choice. You can think of Pascal as an interesting choice. Befuddle's a good soft removal option, especially if you are having trouble against aggro decks. The deck shouldn't have trouble against aggro decks though, just letting you know. Friends on the other side, we run that already. Reflection is an interesting one. It's a song and it's also a 1 cost. However, it doesn't replace itself. That's why I chose to exclude it. Yeah, even though you get to like see what you're about to draw, it doesn't actually draw you cards, and that's kind of a problem, especially in a deck that wants resources. Aurora and Shift Aurora is interesting. You could probably use that for you could probably include that in the deck if you wanted more support. Develop Your Brain is a solid choice. There are a couple of other things here. I mean, the MIM package is always an option, right? MIMs are really strong, and you can't not consider them. Because they're so good. I just chose to omit them because I wanted to maximize the I guess efficiency of the deck. And these 2 cards, although they're really strong, they didn't advance my win condition, which was ramp really hard, play Gramma Tala, win game. Yeah. So, but I could totally see Madam Mim being useful in the deck, especially if you want to recycle your Yzmas, your Gastons. Heck, you can even recycle, what else can you recycle? Your Hirams if you need to. Cusco's an interesting option. I think Cusco is a good 2-drop, so you can definitely include that in the deck. I like Blue Fairy though because of the synergy with all the Floodborn we run, but if you're running a different variation, you can also consider Cusco. Pinocchio is something that I'm considering. It's an uninkable 2-mana card, and it's 1/1, which are super weak stats. However, it is a form of soft removal, and it helps whenever I need to deal with like a pesky Ursula or something else, right? So that's a card you can consider in the deck. I'd only run like 1 or 2 though. Gruesome and Grim is also a card you can consider. I think if you're running more 4 costs that can challenge, like the 4 ink cost 3/4 Elsa with Challenger +3, that's a card you can consider. But yeah, it's uninkable as well, which kind of hurts the deck a little bit. the consistency of the deck, I should say. Noi is an interesting two drop to include. I think if I was running Tamatoa and like a bigger item package, I think Noi could definitely fit in the deck, especially if I open up with Popsicle. Resist 1 and Ward make it pretty hard to kill until like later turns, so and it quests for 2 lore, which is something that you can't really like overlook, especially because it costs 2 ink, right? So Noi is an interesting option, definitely something to consider. Judy Hops is also an interesting tech choice. I think if you're running into a lot of, or if you're expecting to run into a lot of like flutes, spellbooks, lucky dimes, Hops is something that you can include. It's inkable too, so even if you're not running against a deck that runs items, or you can still ink the Judy Hops, and 2 lore is not bad. Other things to consider, Nothing to Hide. Nothing to Hide is a good option. It replaces itself, and you get to scout your opponent's hand. Maybe if you need to like scout for a Be Prepared or scout for a whole new world, Nothing to Hide is definitely something you can include. I would heavily consider running like 1 or 2. Maybe that's something we work around. Yeah, other options, other options. I think that's it. We talked about Magica for a bit. Sorcerer's Hat is interesting. Locations. We haven't talked about locations, and I think locations are definitely something we need to consider here. The 2 locations that I'm talking about are going to be McDuck Manor and Queen's Castle. I think if you have enough tempo on board, which most of the time you do, these cards can be great inclusions. They advance your win condition by just being things that gain lore every turn. Queen's Castle nets you more draw, and McDuck Manor is just really hard to, really hard to get rid of unless you're running you know, unless you're running a deck that runs steel, right? So these 2 cards are worth considering for. I chose to omit them because I prefer contesting board, especially in this deck where we don't run a lot of removal options, so it's super important that we open with something to put on board, right? Whether that be your 1-drops or 2-drops. Just something to consider. But yeah, Queen's Castle and McDuck Manor, if you feel like you can get way ahead on tempo, you can play these cards, and these cards will be so good. Cool. Okay, so this video is going on for quite a while. We're just going to end with some matchup advice, and then I'll post another video with some gameplay. Matchup advice. There are 2 things you want to think about. Am I playing aggro or am I playing control? If I'm playing aggro, and aggro, just for the sake of simplicity, we can lump tempo and mid-range in there. Aggro is basically a deck that wants to control board early stages of the game and convert their massive advantage of tempo to a victory, right? If you can't tell what an aggro deck is, if they're playing a 1-cost card with that quest for 2 lore, they're most likely playing aggro. So how you deal with that aggro deck? You want to contest board as much as possible, right? So you're aiming to mulligan for your Chernobog's followers, your Fiki, your Blue Fairy, your Gramma Tala, and you want to ramp while you're contesting board. So having the Mama Odie on board is pretty important. Luckily, that's already kind of embedded in our game plan, so you don't need to think too hard about the mulligan. Just look for Rafiki and Chernobogs and Mama Odie and something that can ramp, and you'll be fine. As long as you contest board, you trade efficiently, you should be okay. There are some instances where your opponent will do cheeky things like play a 2-drop LeFou that readies your opponent, or readies a exerted creature so that you can't trade and attack. If that's the case, just keep ramping and get to your Gramma Tala and pressure your opponent that way. You will be able to out-resource your opponent for sure if you can achieve this game plan. Yeah. If your opponent, even if your opponent's playing like a whole new world, right, you can still out-resource. And if you get a whole new world with this deck, that's great for you because 1, it gives you more options. You have more access to your bigger bodies like Gaston, Gramma Tala, Yzma, and you get more burst out of it, right? So what happens when you get your Gramma Tala out and you have like 4 friend like me's? You can outrace an aggro deck. So That's pretty much the game plan for aggro. Against control, it's a lot more reserved. This matchup's going to be slower. Of course, you still want to contest for board, especially if it's like, I mean, honestly, recent iterations of Ruby Amethyst have been more tempo oriented, so you'd probably want to contest board. But if you're playing something like a Ruby Sapphire, it's easy matchup, super easy matchup. It's free. It's so free. You essentially just ramp, get to your Gramma Tala, get to your Mama Odie. You can, just pressure with Gaston, pressure with Yzma. You can even save your Gramma Talas if you want to for the big OTK. I advise against it though. I think it's just more efficient to just keep consistent pressure on board. And then you also have to be mindful of your opponent's outs, especially if you're playing against the control matchup, right? So, for example, if I'm playing Ruby, or if I'm playing against a Ruby deck, I have to watch out for Be Prepared, right? If I have to watch out for Medusa, I have to watch out for Lady Tremaine. Lady Tremaine has been popping up in some lists lately, right? So, like, for example, like if you're expecting a Lady Tremaine in hand, you know, and you want to play this Gramma Tala, you better be sure you have enough ink to follow up with either a Rafiki or a Turn of Bog's follower or both, right? Some small minion so that if you get Tremaine, you can sack the extra monster. Cool. So that's like general matchup advice. Of course, there are nuances to the game, but overall, like that's pretty much what you want to be thinking while you're playing those types of decks. All right, and that's it for the deck profile. Thank y'all for tuning in. It's pretty long deck profile. I feel like I talked for an hour, but overall, like this deck is really fun. I'm having a great time playing this deck, and I hope when you watch the gameplay footage, you can see why it's so fun because yeah, it's you ramp. Who doesn't love ramping up, drawing cards, and playing big minions? It's great, you know. And you do kind of these like insane combos, which I think is really fun. So if you like the content, please subscribe to the channel, like the video. It helps me out. And also, if you try the deck, let me know how it goes. I would love to see your take on it, and if you make variations, share it in the comments below. I'll also post up the deck list in the description so y'all can check that out. Last thing, quick announcement. I started streaming again. If you want to tune in and hang out on Twitch, you can follow me at Jujutron TV. That's Jujutron TV. I also hang out with viewers, answer questions. You can see me run the deck if I'm playing this still. And yeah, it's a good time. So be sure to follow and subscribe. Be on the lookout when I do stream. But yeah, thank you guys again for being a part of this, watching the video. If you made it all the way through the end, good for you. Thanks for tuning in, and excited to see y'all try out the deck. Peace, take care, see you next time.